There's an Old English tale about a pretty young girl with golden flowing locks who discovers a house deep in the woods. There she sits on the residents' chairs, eats the residents' porridge, and even sleeps on the residents' beds. But it turns out that the house is owned by a family of 3 bears who wake her up when they discover her, and she quickly runs away from the house. Goldilocks and the 3 Bears is one of England's most popular fairy tales, but did you know that it may have had its origins in a story about 2 of our native animal species? It was passed down through word of mouth before finally being written down and then adapted a couple of times before it became the tale that we know today.
Subscribe to Ferroforest to keep learning about UK nature.
The history behind Goldilocks' tale is pretty clear over the last 200 years in how it's been changing, but this may stretch back much further. It could even have its origins in medieval animal tales.
The most recognisable version of the Goldilocks story to modern audiences features an innocent child with golden hair, a family of 3 messy bears who left the door open to their house, and a happy ending where the characters learn moral lessons. However, the name Goldilocks has only been used since 1904 in a version of the tale published by Flora Annie Steel and Arthur Rackham. A year earlier, William Wallace Denslow illustrated a version of the tale that gave the child the name Goldenhair. Going back a little further to 1878, we find the first description in texts of the bears as a family of mother, father and child. Prior to this, they are described as 3 male bears of different sizes. 10 years beforehand, in 1968, the girl's characteristic golden hair was mentioned for the first time. In versions before this, her hair is described as silver, and in 1858 there are versions where her name is actually Silverlocks. A large change to the story happened in 1850 when Joseph Cundall published his version, where a rude silver-haired child had angered the bears and the littlest bear is the sympathetic victim. Before this publication, the story actually featured a silver-haired old woman rather than a child, but Joseph Cundall thought that there were too many fairy tales with old ladies as the villains, and so changed the character. Now we arrive further back in time to 1837, when Robert Southey wrote the story of the 3 Bears. In his tale, a trio of civilised bears go out for a walk while they wait for their porridge to cool down. A malicious old woman then breaks into the house to mess with the property. She eats the littlest bear's food, breaks his chair, and then falls asleep in his bed, before running away at the end of the story. For a long time, Southey was credited as the original author of the tale that went on to become Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, but this may not be entirely true. A homemade version of Southey's tale, dated to 6 years before his publication, was found to have been written by Eleanor Moore for her 4-year-old nephew. In this much darker version of the tale, the old woman doesn't manage to escape. The bears try to burn her, then drown her, and finally impale her on a church steeple. But if Southey didn't create this story, where did he get it from? Here is where the story becomes even more focused on our wildlife. It's thought that Southey might have learnt this tale in his childhood from his uncle, and not only that, but he also misinterpreted how it was told. It's thought that Southey's uncle was actually telling him a tale about a female fox invading the home of 3 bears. A female fox is known as a vixen, but in the 1800s the word vixen could also be used to describe a malicious woman, and so in confusing this word, the tale of a female fox and bears became a tale of a malicious old lady and bears. Evidence that the original tale was about a fox can be found in books written by Joseph Jacobs and John Batten in the late 1800s, where he writes down an old tale called Scrapefoot, which was passed down by word of mouth. Although there's no definitive proof that Southey's tale is an adaptation of Scrapefoot, the stories are extremely similar.
In Scrapefoot, a classic trickster fox from folktale decides to enter the castle owned by 3 bears. There it sits on their thrones, drinks their milk, and even sleeps on their beds. When they enter the castle and find the fox, they throw it out of the window. With red foxes and bears historically sharing ranges across Europe, including the UK up until the early medieval period about 1500 years ago, it shouldn't be too surprising that they often feature in stories together. This tradition of orally passing down stories to each generation could eventually end up in a tale like Scrapefoot, and therefore it's not too far a stretch of the imagination to think that Scrapefoot finds its origins in this medieval storytelling tradition, and that Goldilocks itself has its origins in a much more historical oral folk tale rather than as a classic modern fairy tale.
These medieval tales and artworks of feuding foxes and bears are so numerous throughout Europe that they earned their own collective name called Reynard the Fox. Reynard is an anthropomorphic red fox who tricks other animals for his own advantage. Although his main enemy and victim is his uncle, the wolf Isengrim, a cast of all sorts of species appears in these stories, including bears.
But where might this interest in the feud between red foxes and bears actually come from? Well, bears have been extinct in the UK for hundreds of years, so we're going to need to go and look at Europe and North America for examples of their relationship. Where their ranges still overlap, bears are known to kill foxes, so it could have been sightings of these sorts of interactions that fueled these medieval tales. However, when bears do kill foxes, it's actually a very rare occurrence and normally occurs as a way to remove competition from the environment rather than just to kill it to eat it.
So perhaps there is another way that these species might have been seen in close proximity and inspired imaginations.
In North America, grey foxes will spend time near bears as a way of avoiding coyotes. Coyotes avoid the bears, and bears themselves pose less of a threat to the foxes than the coyotes do. Although in Europe we don't have coyotes, there could have been a similar dynamic going on with the red fox, bears and grey wolves. If people in medieval times had seen a dynamic where bears and foxes were near each other but no attacks were happening, this could have sparked some curiosity that led to stories being passed down. This could have developed within the Reynard the Fox tales between stories of foxes and bears, which eventually led into Scrapefoot being developed, and finally into the more recent Goldilocks.
As a verbal tale, there is no one definitive version of Scrapefoot, but I wanted to share with you the version recorded by Jacobs and Batten so that you could see just how similar it is to our modern Goldilocks. Once upon a time, there were 3 bears who lived in a castle in a great wood. One of them was a great big bear, one was a middling bear, and one was a little bear. And in the same wood there was a fox who lived all alone. His name was Scrapefoot. Scrapefoot was very much afraid of the bears, but for all that, he wanted very much to know all about them. And one day, as he went through the wood, he found himself near the bear's castle, and he wondered whether he could get into that castle. He looked all about him everywhere, and he could not see anyone. So he came up very quietly, till at last he came up to the door of the castle, and he tried whether he could open it. Yes, the door was not locked, and he opened it just a little way and put his nose in and looked, and he could not see anyone. So then he opened it a little way farther and put one paw in, then another paw, and another, and then he was all in the bear's castle. He found he was in a great hall with 3 chairs in it, one big, one middling, and one little chair, and he thought that he would like to sit down and rest and look about him. So he sat down on the big chair, but he found it so hard and uncomfortable that it made his bones ache, and he jumped down at once and got into the middling chair, and he turned round and round in it, but he couldn't make himself comfortable. So then he went to the little chair and sat down in it, and it was so soft and warm and comfortable that Scrapefoot was quite happy. But all at once it broke into pieces under him and he couldn't put it together again. So he got up and began to look about him again, and on one table he saw 3 saucers, of which one was very big, one was middling, and one was quite a little saucer. Scrapefoot was very thirsty and he began to drink out of the big saucer, but he only just tasted the milk in the big saucer, which was so sour and so nasty that he would not taste another drop of it. Then he tried the middling saucer, and he drank a little of that. He tried 2 or 3 mouthfuls, but it was not nice, and then he left it and went to the little saucer. And the milk in the little saucer was so sweet and so nice that he went on drinking it till it was all gone. Then Scrapefoot thought that he would like to go upstairs, and he listened and he could not hear anyone. So upstairs he went, and he found a great room with 3 beds in it. One was a big bed, and one was a middling bed, and one was a little white bed. And he climbed up into the big bed, but it was so hard and lumpy and uncomfortable that he jumped down again at once, and he tried the middling bed. That was rather better, but he could not get comfortable in it. So after turning about a while, he got up and went to the little bed, and that was so soft and so warm and so nice that he fell fast asleep all at once. And after a time the bears came home, and when they got into the hall, the big bear went to his chair and said, "Who's been sitting in my chair?" And the middling bear said, "Who's been sitting in my chair?" And the little bear said, "Who's been sitting in my chair and has broken it all to pieces?" And then they went to have their milk, and the big bear said, "Who's been drinking my milk?" And the middling bear said, "Who's been drinking my milk?" And the little bear said, "Who's been drinking my milk and has drunk it all up?" Then they went upstairs and into the bedroom, and the big bear said, "Who's been sleeping in my bed?" And the middling bear said, "Who's been sleeping in my bed?" And the little bear said, "Who's been sleeping in my bed? And see, here he is." So then the bears came and wondered what they should do with him. And the big bear said, "Let's hang him." And the middling bear said, "Let's drown him." And then the little bear said, "Let's throw him out of the window." And then the bears took him to the window, and the big bear took 2 legs on one side, and the middling bear took 2 legs on the other side, and they swung him backwards and forwards, and out of the window. Poor Scrapefoot was so frightened, and he thought every bone in his body must be broken. But he got up and first shook one leg. No, that was not broken. And then another, and that was not broken. And another, and another. And then he wagged his tail and found that there were no bones broken. So then he galloped off home as fast as he could, and never went near the bear's castle again. What do you think? Does the tale of Goldilocks originate from medieval people watching the interaction between red foxes and bears? Are there any other tales that you know of that take their inspiration from our native species? Make sure to check out some of my other videos to learn more about our relationship with UK nature.